It is that time of year, everybody, with the college football season and NFL regular season in the books. The 2023 NFL draft cycle is basically here, and today I'm going to be doing my very first mock draft of the year. Over these past few years, I've had a mock draft series here on this channel, and although I plan on having plenty of mock drafts over these next few months, it's not going to be on this channel. Down in the description, as well as in a card at the top right of your screen, you may notice my secondary channel where I'm going to be posting all of my draft-related content this year, whether it's mock drafts, player evaluations and rankings and whatnot. I may even do some things with some viewers regarding to the draft. So it's going to be a lot of fun this year. We're going to be doing some different things over there. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure to check that channel out and subscribe for all of my future mock drafts and draft content going forward. I still wanted to put one mock draft here on the main channel just to sort of promote that channel while also giving you guys a sneak peek of what to expect on the draft channel. Today we're going to be doing one round with no trades, and it's going to be a predictive mock draft, so not necessarily what I would do, but more so what I am predicting to happen. There's a good shot we see a lot of trades on draft night, particularly the Chicago Bears likely trading the number one pick, but since there are no trades in this mock, the Bears will keep the number one pick and draft a player. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road. The number one pick is very fascinating this year because it belongs to the Chicago Bears, a team who has a franchise quarterback in place, or so we think, with Justin Fields, who showed a lot of flashes this past season. Now, there's a very good shot Chicago gets out of this pick. It would make all the sense in the world for them to trade down and get an absolute haul. As we've seen over the past few years, these top picks have more and more value. The Dolphins got 3 first-round picks to move down just 9 spots a couple of years ago, and they turned those picks into Jalen Waddle, Tyree, and Bradley Chubb. So you've got to assume the Bears really like the idea of getting their own version of that with a team like the Colts or the Raiders or somebody else trying to move up here to this top spot to jump the Texans, presumably for Bryce Young. But since there are no trades, the Bears will be making this pick and actually drafting a player. I don't want to rule out the idea of them drafting a quarterback. I imagine there will be discussions within the organization, but I do find it pretty unlikely that's the route they go with. So, assuming they keep the pick and don't want to pick a quarterback, I think it's going to be one of the top 2 defensive players, either Jalen Carter out of Georgia or Will Anderson out of Alabama. I don't think you can really go wrong either way, but personally, as of now, I think it's a little bit more likely that the Bears would be interested in Jalen Carter. This young man is a total game wrecker in the middle of the defensive line, and the Bears' defense, particularly their front unit, was an utter train wreck last year. They got to go defense early, and with guys like Jalen Carter and Will Anderson, who are true blue-chip talents at the top of this class, the Bears can't really go wrong with either one of them. That'll bring up the Houston Texans at 2. I had them getting Bryce Young, the quarterback out of the University of Alabama. So there's a very high likelihood that Bryce Young ends up being the number one pick. It's not as much of a slam dunk as, say, Joe Burrow or Trevor Lawrence from years past, but it's highly likely that Bryce Young will ultimately be the top pick. It's more so a question of which team is it going to be. The Texans really screwed themselves last week by winning, because if they lost, it would have been a lot easier. They get the number one pick, they get Bryce Young, end of story. But it's not that simple. Now, luckily for them, the Bears keep the number one pick here, and they get Jalen Carter. So it works out for Houston. They get Bryce Young, their franchise quarterback. Chances are it won't end up being this simple when it's all said and done, but in a no-trades reality, it works out pretty well for the Texans. That'll bring up the Cardinals here at 3. You got to assume they're going to pick whoever's left of Will Anderson and Jalen Carter, and ultimately that player is Will Anderson. Now, if someone moves up to number 1 to get Bryce Young, and maybe the Texans pick a quarterback at 2, there's a chance the Cardinals could have both Carter and Anderson on the board come draft night. And if that's the case, I think Arizona's going to have a pretty tough decision because, again, you can't really go wrong either way. But with Jalen Carter off the board, it's a pretty easy pick. Will Anderson's the guy. Boom. Let's move on. The Colts at 4 get C.J. Stroud, quarterback out of the Ohio State University. So, CJ Stroud is a pretty interesting case, coming off a phenomenal performance in the college football playoff against Georgia, where he really turned a lot of people's heads, myself included. Now, I do see a world where Will Levis goes ahead of CJ Stroud because teams are going to be enamored with the physical upside that Levis brings to the table compared to CJ Stroud. However, I think given the choice of both quarterbacks, I think the Colts would probably prefer Stroud. Now, CJ Stroud is not officially declared for the NFL draft yet, and the deadline is only 2 days away. It's this coming Monday, and there are some rumors that CJ Stroud is considering returning to school. I find these actually quite interesting. Normally, when a player of his caliber takes a while to enter the draft, I would normally just brush it under the rug. It's not a big deal. He's eventually going to declare. But with CJ Stroud, I actually find it kind of interesting because I do see a world where he returns to school. I wouldn't say it's likely. A player of his caliber who's likely going to be a top 5 pick would be wise to enter the NFL. You get your contract now. You don't have to worry about playing poorly or getting injured in college. And if either of those things were to happen his senior season, he could end up losing a lot of money. But on the flip side, there are a lot of pros for him coming back to Ohio State. NIL money. They have all of their offensive weapons back. Marvin Harrison, Emeka Egbuka, all those guys are coming back. Bryan Hartline is now the offensive coordinator. He's the best position coach in college football. And maybe CJ Stroud wants to avoid getting drafted by the Texans, and I actually think that is very plausible. I remember a few years ago when people were calling for Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence to try to hold out from getting drafted by the Bengals and Jaguars, and I found that to be baloney because those two teams are bad, but they're not dumpster fires like the Texans. And sure enough, here we are a few years later, and Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence both have those teams in the playoffs. So I don't think players hold out like CJ Stroud if there's a bad team who's likely to pick them. But with the Texans, it's different because the Houston Texans are a complete dumpster fire. Their organization is a mess. And if I was CJ Stroud, I would not want to go to the Houston Texans. Or if I was any quarterback for that matter, I really wouldn't want to go. So I understand the possibility of CJ Stroud returning to school. And again, I don't think it's likely, but I think it's more possible than people think. That'll bring up the Seattle Seahawks at 5. They get Myles Murphy, the edge rusher out of Clemson. He's a little bit raw, but he's got great physical tools and upside. I think Seattle loves the idea of adding a true number 1 pass rusher with one of their 2 first-round picks. They could be a sneaky QB destination with Geno Smith's contract running out, but I think Myles Murphy here at 5 makes a lot of sense for them. That'll bring up my Detroit Lions here at the number 6 pick, and this is kind of an awkward spot because the top 2 defensive players are off the board. Myles Murphy could make sense, and he is gone. So I have the Lions throwing a little bit of a curveball here with Christian Gonzalez, the cornerback out of Oregon. There's a lot of names in the talk for the top corner off the board, whether it's Kelee Ringo, Cam Smith, Joey Porter, Devin Witherspoon had a great season at Illinois. But personally, as of now, I think it's going to be Christian Gonzalez. He's got great size and length, 6'2", long arms, good ball skills, good production this year at Oregon after a couple of years at Colorado. So not a lot of people are really talking about him as CB1, but I think there's a bigger shot than people think that he is the first cornerback off the board. That'll bring us to the Raiders at 7 with Derek Carr pretty much out the door. The Raiders are going to be a QB-needy team in the offseason, and with Will Levis on the board, I think they're going to be really intrigued by the physical upside that he brings. Will Levis is, I would say, by far the most polarizing player in this draft because there are some people who see the physical tools and think Josh Allen. There are other people who watch him and think he's terrible, and I think it's a mix of both. The physical upside with Will Levis is really impressive, and I understand why a team would want to take a shot on him. But on the flip side, the production has not been at a high level at Kentucky, and it's easy to make the argument that he was in a terrible offensive situation with bad skill position players and bad offensive linemen. And yes, that is true, and you have to give him a little bit of slack there, but Will Levis also has a long ways to go in his development. So because of that, he's a really polarizing player, and I think there is a shot he could go really early, say in the top 5, maybe ahead of CJ Stroud, and maybe he goes later than this. Maybe teams are worried about the production, but I think somebody's going to see the physical upside and think, I want my own Josh Allen, or I want my own Justin Herbert. Someone's going to take a shot on him in the top 10, and I could see it being the Raiders. That'll bring up the Atlanta Falcons here at pick 8. They go with Tyree Wilson, the pass rusher out of Texas Tech. Atlanta could use some more bodies in the front unit. Tyree Wilson's a very, very talented pass rusher, and after him, there is a little bit of a drop-off in terms of edge rushing talent. So I could see Atlanta going this route, although there are a bunch of different positions the Falcons could look at. I think Atlanta is one of the most interesting teams here in the top 10 because there's so many different routes that they could go with on both sides of the ball, but I think they've really got to improve that defense, particularly that front unit, and Tyree Wilson's going to be their guy. That'll bring us to the Carolina Panthers here at the 9th pick, and they'll draft the top receiver off the board, Quentin Johnston out of TCU. Johnston did not play all that well in the national championship game on Monday, which I guess you can say the same about everybody on TCU. But I think Carolina is really going to be intrigued by his size and his athleticism. Johnston had a phenomenal season for TCU as a big play threat who could stretch the field. Carolina's got some good receivers on the roster already. DJ Moore's a very good player. Levis Chenault was a high draft pick. I mean, I wouldn't know if I'd say he's going to be a long-term piece there. Terrace Marshall, former second-rounder, was pretty good this year. But I think they could certainly look to add another weapon to the offense. And I think Quentin Johnston would be a pretty solid pick here. The Philadelphia Eagles at 10 go with Bryan Bresee, the defensive lineman out of Clemson. Bresee's a pretty interesting case for me because he was the #1 recruit in his high school class, and I don't think he quite lived up to his potential. There were a number of reasons for this. He tore his ACL as a sophomore. He missed some games this year because of the unfortunate passing of his sister. Obviously, you can't really dock his stock for that. But he hasn't really been consistent in terms of production. So he's a little bit of a wild card, but I think with his pedigree and his athleticism and upside, somebody could take a shot on him early. And I think a team like the Philadelphia Eagles, who are getting a little bit older within the interior of their defensive line, could take a look at him. And I think Bresee and Jordan Davis could be a really nice duo going forward, along with Javon Hargrave, who's still young enough to where he has a few more years left. Milton Williams is also an interesting young player. So I think the Eagles' defensive line could be really nasty. And with a guy like Bresee there, it could be even better. Peter Skoronski, offensive tackle out of Northwestern to the Titans. I think there's a good shot Tennessee really focuses on the offensive side of the ball this year, whether it's an offensive lineman or it's a playmaker. They need both bad, and Skoronski I think could be a really good pick. Physically, there are some similarities to another former Northwestern offensive lineman, Rashawn Slater. A lot of scouts thought Slater didn't have the size and length to play tackle at a high level. They thought he would have to move over to guard. Obviously, that has not been the case. Rashawn Slater, when healthy, which hasn't been much this year, but when he's played, he's been a very good tackle. So I think scouts are going to see that with Slater and realize Skoronski certainly has a future at offensive tackle at the next level. And as of now, I think he'll be the first player at his position off the board. The Texans are up at 12. They drafted their franchise quarterback with Bryce Young, so now they're going to give him a little bit of help with Michael Mayer, the tight end out of Notre Dame. Mayer is a fantastic tight end prospect. Other than Kyle Pitts, who's like a total unicorn, Mayer is up there as one of probably the 2 or 3 best tight end prospects of the last decade, right up there with a guy like TJ Hawkinson, per se. I think there are some similarities between the two of them. So I think Houston knows that they need to get as much help as possible for Bryce Young, because obviously they are not a great team. I think that goes without saying. So if they can continue to build up that offensive line and add some more playmakers for their new quarterback, I think that'd be very wise. Broderick Jones, the offensive tackle out of Georgia to the Jets. The Jets are certainly a team who probably will look to add a quarterback in the offseason. Personally, I think they're going to lean more towards a veteran like a Derek Carr or a Jimmy Garoppolo, or maybe if somebody even better like a Lamar Jackson becomes available. I don't think the Jets want to go down the road of drafting a young quarterback again, because I think they're getting a little bit impatient, and rightfully so. The New York Jets have a great roster. They have a great young core of players who are ready to win. But the problem is they don't have a quarterback. So I think they're going to address that early, whether they acquire a guy like Jimmy G or Carr, or maybe Lamar, or maybe somebody else. I think New York is going to have their quarterback situation figured out by the time we get to late April for the draft. So instead, they're going to add some protection with Broderick Jones, the offensive tackle out of the University of Georgia. It never hurts to add more offensive line, and tackle is certainly a position the Jets could look at. Mekhi Becton's long-term health seems to be up in the air. I'm not really sure if George Fant is going to be back next year. So I think they kind of want to patch up that left tackle spot, and they're going to do so with Broderick Jones. The New England Patriots here at 14 get Brian Branch, the versatile defensive back out of Alabama. This pick screams Bill Belichick. Versatile defensive back who can play all over the field in the secondary, whether it's out as a safety, in the nickel, out wide. He can do just about everything, and the fact that he's a Nick Saban guy makes it all the better for Bill Belichick. Felix Anudike-Uzomah, the edge rusher out of Kansas State, going to the Green Bay Packers. I think Packers fans are going to be clamoring for a playmaker here, particularly a wide receiver. But if we've learned anything over the last few years, it's that Brian Gutekunst is not going to use a first-round pick on a wide receiver. So I think they could look on the defensive side of the ball, adding another pass rusher with Anudike-Uzomah. I think this will be a solid pick for them. And then the Washington Commanders at 16 get Cam Smith, cornerback out of South Carolina. So Smith ends up being the second corner off the board. Not Joey Porter, not Kelee Ringo. Washington's certainly going to look to add some more guys to the secondary, and Smith's a pretty versatile player. You can put him on the outside, you can put him on the inside. I think they're really going to like his skill set. The Pittsburgh Steelers at 17 add to the offensive line with Paris Johnson Jr. out of Ohio State. I'll be honest, Kenny Pickett genuinely surprised me in a good way this year. I was impressed with how he played, particularly down the stretch, and I was a little bit disappointed to see the Steelers not get in the playoffs because they've been playing some great football these last few weeks, and I'm more intrigued by them than, say, a team like the Miami Dolphins, who are down to their third-string quarterback. The Steelers certainly do need to add to the offensive line. That's been an issue with them for a few years now, and they're finally going to get their left tackle of the future with Paris Johnson. The Lions are back up with their second first-round pick of the day. There are going to be some discussions about quarterback, but I find it very unlikely. I think Brad Holmes really likes Jared Goff, and for good reason. Jared Goff had a great season this year, so I completely understand it. The Lions are going to pick Drew Sanders, the linebacker out of Arkansas. Sanders is a really intriguing player, and I think a lot of people are going to be surprised to see him going this high over a guy like Trenton Simpson. But I think Drew Sanders is a very versatile athlete. He spent the first couple of years of his career at the University of Alabama, and he transfers over to Arkansas, where he's a really big season for them. I think the Lions' linebacking core isn't great. It's not as bad as people think. Obviously, Rodrigo had a very solid rookie year. Alex Anzalone played pretty well down the stretch. Derek Barnes is an intriguing young player. But I don't think those guys are going to stop you from adding a talent like Drew Sanders. And I think Aaron Glenn and the defensive staff are really going to enjoy using him in a variety of different ways. That'll bring up the Buccaneers at 19. They get Joey Porter Jr., a cornerback out of Penn State. The Bucs need to replenish the cornerback room. They've got some guys whose contracts are coming up and are probably not going to be able to pay because the Bucs have tied up so much money within a lot of their core. They also still have to pay guys like Tristan Wirfs and Antoine Winfield Jr. in the future. So corner is going to be a really big need for Tampa Bay. Joey Porter's a big, physical, long corner. That's the type of guy that the Bucs like having there in the secondary. The Seahawks at 20 go with Anthony Richardson, quarterback out of Florida. Geno Smith had a great season. It's hard not to root for him, but his contract is up at the end of the year. He's, 33 years old, so I don't think Seattle can expect him to be the franchise quarterback going forward. Even if they bring back Geno Smith, why not add a guy like Anthony Richardson who can sit for a year or two? That's probably what's ultimately best for Richardson's development. Learn behind a guy like Geno Smith or whoever they add in the offseason, and then eventually groom him to be the long-term guy. Richardson's another player who's a little bit raw, but he's got really impressive physical tools, and I could absolutely see him going higher than 20. The problem is there was nobody after the Raiders who I think would pick a quarterback in this situation, particularly Richardson. But I think the fit here with Seattle makes a lot of sense. Kelee Ringo finally off the board, the cornerback out of Georgia to the Jaguars. 6'2", 210 pounds, big, long, lean, physical corner. The Jags are really going to enjoy pairing him up with his Georgia counterpart, Tyson Campbell. I think that could be a really nice duo in the future. A lot of people think Kelee Ringo is going to go in the top 10, and I think with his size and upside, I understand why they think that. But personally, I think Ringo's going to go a little bit later than people expect. Still in the first round, however. That'll bring up the New York Giants. They add to the weaponry with wide receiver Jaxon Smith-Njigba out of Ohio State. Jaxon Smith-Njigba was the best receiver in the country last season, and he was the best player in that receiving corps that featured Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, who are probably going to be the top two finishers for the Offensive Rookie of the Year. This season, Smith-Njigba was banged up. He had a hamstring injury, amongst other stuff, so he only played in a few games. He didn't play in the college football playoff, which Todd McShay had a lot to say about. But I still think JSN probably finds his way in the first round as like a big type of slot guy. He's not necessarily a freak athlete. He's not necessarily the biggest guy or the fastest, but he knows how to get open. He knows how to play receiver, smooth player who's dominant after the catch. The New York Giants just need anybody out there at wide receiver rather than the door dashers that they've got playing that position currently. And I think Smith-Njigba could be a nice fit there. Speaking of teams having door dashers at wide receiver, that brings us to the Baltimore Ravens, who are going to add the dynamic speedster Jalen Hyatt out of Tennessee. Hyatt had a huge season this year for the Vols, and Baltimore needs to add playmakers on the offense badly, whether Lamar Jackson is still the quarterback, which I think will be the case, even if Jaxon is gone, which I find highly unlikely, but even if he is, they still need receivers anyway, and I think Jalen Hyatt's a nice fit here. And then Darnell Washington going to the Chargers here at 24. I feel like Darnell Washington's kind of flown under the radar because he's probably not going to be a top tight end off the board with Michael Mayer. And Darnell Washington's not even the best tight end on his college team with Brock Bowers, who presumably is going to be a top half of the first round guy next year. However, Darnell Washington is still really, really good. I still think he finds his way into the first round. The Los Angeles Chargers looking to add another weapon to the offense, and I think he'd be a really nice fit. At 25, I had the Cowboys going with Bijan Robinson, the running back out of Texas. This might be the most fascinating pick of the first round, and I have no clue how Dallas fans are going to feel about it, but I think it makes a lot of sense. So Dallas has a solid duo in the backfield with Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard. Pollard's probably the better of the two, and he's a free agent this coming offseason. I don't know if Dallas is going to want to pay him. They have money tied up into a lot of guys. They're going to have to pay players like Trayvon Diggs and Micah Parsons soon. And the last time the Cowboys paid a running back, Zeke, it completely backfired. So I think there's a good shot they don't pay Tony Pollard unless he ends up being cheaper than expected. So for now, Zeke is the only guy in the backfield, and as he continues to get older and worse, that's not enough. They need somebody else, and I think Jerry Jones is going to be enamored with the idea of adding Bijan Robinson, the best running back prospect to enter the NFL since Saquon Barkley. I think Bijan Robinson ends up going way earlier than this. There just weren't any other clear landing spots. Bijan Robinson, throughout draft season, is going to be mocked to a lot of teams who don't need running backs, and I think fans of those teams are probably not going to be pleased with me or other people who mock Bijan Robinson to their teams, but ultimately somebody's going to pick him early, even if they don't really need a running back, and by the time we get to October, that fan base is going to be so happy that he's on their team because he is so good. So I imagine there's going to be some very interesting discourse throughout this draft season with Bijan Robinson because pretty much everybody in the league has good running backs on their roster, but Bijan Robinson's a great player, and I understand it's a luxury pick, but this is an unbelievable playmaker who, again, is the best running back prospect of the last 5 years. Anton Harrison, offensive tackle out of Oklahoma to the Cincinnati Bengals. They still need to improve their offensive line, and luckily it hasn't caused that many issues over the last 2 years, other than, I guess, the Super Bowl game, which is a pretty big issue, I would suppose. But Anton Harrison's a pretty talented player. Plug him right into one of those tackle spots, and boom, there you go. The Minnesota Vikings at 27 pick Devin Witherspoon, cornerback out of Illinois. This guy had a really good season for the Illini, raising his stock into the first round. And even though Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer are no longer working for Minnesota, their spirit lives on by the Vikings using another high draft pick on a cornerback. Over the last 10 years, it feels like the Vikings have drafted a corner on day 1 or 2 literally every year. And this year is no different because corner is still a pretty big need somehow. Andrew Booth Jr.'s long-term health seems to be a major question mark. And even so, their cornerback room is not great. Their secondary, for the most part, this year was an utter train wreck. They need some more guys back there, such as Devin Witherspoon. The Broncos pick wide receiver Jordan Addison out of USC. He was a little bit disappointing this year despite the emergence of Heisman Trophy winning quarterback Caleb Williams. I think there's a shot Addison could slip out of the first round, but I have him going here late to the Denver Broncos. I think they're certainly going to look to add to the offensive side of the ball because their defense was quietly really good this year. They need more playmakers on offense. I don't think they're going to look to replace Russell Wilson because he's locked up for 5+ years. You might as well try to figure it out with him. So I would expect them to go with a playmaker or an offensive lineman, and they're going to go with Jordan Addison, the talented USC wide receiver. Antonio Johnston, defensive back out of Texas A&M to the Bills. I think secondary sort of the question mark with Buffalo. Their two main safeties, Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde, are starting to get a little bit older. Their contracts are going to be running out soon. The Bills do have some intriguing young players back there. If DeMar Hamlin is ever able to play again, I mean, he is a pretty talented young player who was more than fine when he played this year, but I think safety still could be a pretty noticeable hole on their roster, and I think Antonio Johnston's a pretty talented and versatile player. Rashee Rice, wide receiver out of SMU to the Chiefs. I think Rice is going to go earlier than people think. The Chiefs are investing a lot into the wide receiver position, and I think they're going to keep on doing it. I expect Juju Smith-Schuster to be back, although he is going to command a lot of money because this receiver free agency class is not good. Juju Smith-Schuster is the best receiver in this year's free agency, and it's really not that close. So because of that, he's going to get a lot of money, more than people think, whether it's from the Chiefs or somebody else. So I think even if they do bring him back, they're certainly going to consider wide receiver early, and I think Rashee Rice, who had a great season this year at Southern Methodist University, would be a good fit for this offense. And then wrapping up with the Philadelphia Eagles at 31, they go with Darnell Wright, offensive tackle out of Tennessee. Darnell Wright's a pretty talented player, and with Lane Johnson getting older and looking more and more injury prone, the Eagles need to figure out their replacement. Philadelphia's had one of the best offensive lines in the league for a number of years now, and I imagine Howie Roseman would like to keep that going. So with Lane Johnson's retirement inevitable, they're certainly going to be looking for his replacement. They've already got ahead of the game with finding Jason Kelsey's replacement, drafting Landon Dickerson a couple years ago, who since has moved over to guard, and then last year drafting Cam Jurgens in the second round out of Nebraska. So I think they're going to do the same thing with Lane Johnson. Find a long-term replacement early so you don't have to worry about it in the future. So that's going to wrap it up. Our 2023 NFL Mock Draft 1.0 is now in the books. Let me know what you thought of your favorite teams' picks down below in the comments. Which selections did you like? Which picks did you not like? Plenty of more draft content coming out here within the next couple of weeks and months. I'm very excited about it. I'm really happy that draft season's back, and I hope you guys are ready. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.